And you can see it in the rhetoric. The rhetoric here on the one side is about how bad all of this, and they want the security of their investments guaranteed. And Yu Yongdong, a former advisor to the government of the Central Bank of China, essentially said that he hated the United States for what they were doing. But at the same time, he said there was no alternative but for them to keep buying treasuries to preserve the value of their existing investment. So it's like throwing good money after bad. So this problem is very, very fundamental, and it has a political dimension as well. I do not think I would like to be the Chinese leadership which stands up in front of a billion people to say the $2 trillion that you earned by working 24 hours a day, 7 days a week in terribly unfavorable conditions for terrible pay has now disappeared because we have actually used it unwisely. That is the stuff of pitchforks and shovels and revolutions, and the Chinese would be acutely aware of that. So it's a very, very deep economic problem, but it's also a social and political problem which has to be dealt with.
In terms of the amount of government debt issuance that's going to be required this year, as you've alluded to, simply staggering, around about $5 trillion, with the US, as you've said, requiring 2/3 of that. Is it a case of the longer it takes for the recovery to kick in, the greater the risk that the global financial system almost implodes under its own weight?
Well, I think it's actually a little bit of an underestimate to say $5 trillion. That's just what it is this year. But if you look at the cycle over since the economy started to slow down, it's probably closer to 10 to 15 trillion. And if we take previous crises into account, then that amount could go up to close to 30 trillion. Now, to put that into perspective, the amount of global savings is around 120 trillion. So what you're saying is the governments of the world will roughly absorb in the next 2 years or 3 years roughly a quarter of the entire savings pool in the world. That's not sustainable. And we are already seeing signs of that. For instance, Ireland was faced with the invidious choice of not being able to finance its debt. And so under those circumstances, they put up taxes. And we're starting to see talk of taxes in other jurisdictions as well. So essentially, the whole game can't go on as much as this. And the only thing, essentially, people are now gambling on is strong growth. Because the only thing that would get you out of this is effectively strong growth and essentially also a dose of inflation, because it would reduce the value of the debt at the same time. That is the gamble or the chips on the roulette table the governments of the world have in desperation placed. And the most curious thing about that is the markets seem to have actually assumed it's going to work. But, you know, the odds in roulette aren't very good.
And as you've already suggested, where the argument falls down is that if the growth is going to come from the consumer who is already highly indebted, then their ability to spend is significantly more constrained than it was 2 or 3 years ago.
That's absolutely correct. And I think I would add one more point. What you are seeing here is a coordinated global slowdown. And that makes it even harder because previously we've had slowdowns, but they haven't been uniform and spread across the world. So there has been a part of the world which has been growing, which actually through the 90s and 2000s, for the main part, was the United States. So essentially what you had was some part of the world growing, which enabled the other parts to piggyback on top of that. So you're correct, there's constraints on consumption spending, but it's also global, the phenomena, which makes it extremely difficult to manage. So under those circumstances, the challenges ahead for both economic and political policy are enormous.
Just in terms of the US, total China reserves, therefore less than a year's worth of the current borrowing requirements of the US. If we assume that the US will be forced to issue $3 trillion worth of debt, say, in the next 12 months, how much will it be forced to borrow in the following years? Well,
it's very difficult to say. There's a very amusing side note to that. Geithner, as you know, was in Beijing a couple of months ago, and he went to Beijing University to address the students, and he was asked about some mathematics of how the U.S. would get out of that, and the U.S. budget deficit this year is 12%. He said next year it would be 3%, bringing howls of laughter from the students. So basically, they're just gambling that they will be able to grow the economy at a level which enables this amount to fall without causing any stress. There is some good news, however. The U.S. savings rate has jumped very, very quickly from 0 to around 6%. Now, 6% of $15 trillion is about $1 trillion, and some portion of that will help fund effectively the actual issuance. So there is some switching going on, but obviously it has to be resolved pretty quickly. It's not a circumstance which can continue indefinitely.
If we compare where we are today, say to 12 months ago, are the known unknowns fewer?
Well, I think we now know most of the elements of the problem that we are facing. And we are in a much better shape in terms of understanding the dimensions and the issues. However, there are two issues with that. The understanding of the issues does not necessarily mean there are any glib and easy solutions. And on the other side, the problem is what this will ultimately do is actually choke off growth in the world. So whatever happens, we're in for a period of very sluggish growth. And I think there is a fairly unanimous agreement on that particular front. And the unknown is that growth level 0 to 1% or 0 to 2% or 1 to 3% versus, say, the 4 to 6% we've enjoyed for the last 20 years? And that is the biggest single factor in how this will play out.
Sajyatdas there, author of Traders, Guns and Money. And if you'd like to receive his article, just send an email to sundaybusiness@radiolive.co.nz. That's sundaybusiness, all one word, at radiolive.co.nz, and I'll forward you a link to his article. Very good summation. In fact, one of the best I've read in recent months of what actually is happening and the causes of the global financial crisis. And that's our program for today. Thanks for joining us. As always, a reminder that from midday tomorrow, you can listen back to today's program in its entirety by going to our website, radiolive.co.nz, and just click on the audio on demand link.